So here again we can refer to the surface charge, or the information as it is expressed on the surface, as opposed to any recursion that subsequently occurs after that. We can refer to this main or this prime surface charge where the neutral plane is lit up and thus parts of it expresses electrically charged information. We can refer to this surface as the largest and most intense electrical point relative to the associative and lower electrical charges or frequencies being introduced into the virtual recursive matrix. So this prime surface is a real electrical charge. All other representations or expressions of this charge down through the matrix is virtual. So if we stop thinking so much about solids, fluids, gases, and really start framing our cognizance relative to just the idea or the concept of information predominantly, then we can see that the reflective holographic principles can occur regardless of any state defined as solid, fluid, or gas. And so long as we can see that reflective holographic principles can occur, and thus convection occur ensuing from that in the recursion, then we're actually removing completely out of our thinking these concepts and these self-referential descriptions and definitions of solids, fluids, and gas, or for mass or weight for that matter. So it's very important to realize that the word surface, as I'm using it, does not refer to the makeup of an object, whether it's a solid, a fluid, a gas, or whatever. The word surface represents a principle that exists relative to things, really the surface just represents a boundary, a demarcation, a limit. So the word boundary does not fit any descriptions of solid, fluid, or gas. The word boundary, surface, means a condition of things, not the things themselves or what they're comprised of, and resulting in our labeling them fluid, solid, or gas, or whatever. So we're simply talking about reflected information, simple, elegant. We're talking about reflection. Remove all these other concepts and start thinking about principles of holographic principles. We're simply talking about reflected information that can exist as so reflected relative to what we have defined as solids, fluids, or gases. I believe after my theorem is fully expressed, we'll see how important it is to totally redefine and refine our descriptions and definitions in science, physics, as well, even beyond that, cosmology, mathematics, astronomy. So in this sense, our concepts and perceptions of processes, and as well as our definitions, are really remotely describing the reality the correct way. If we are actually talking purely about information, and in many senses, in most aspects of this whole system, virtual information, we really have to realize that if we're really talking about that holographic reality is the case, then how would we explain that? How would we express that? And how would we demonstrate that reality in a correct way, mathematically and through scientific statements? I'm asserting that most of our descriptions of the system and most of our defining of terms or definitions of terms are superfluous. We can do away with this whole mass mentality, and so as to replace it with the holographic principles. And in this sense, we would be replacing the standard model completely, almost virtually completely, with the model that I'm describing, which I'm going to continue to elaborate on through this theorem, through these series of videos. So we could remove virtually all of our hypermass statements, mathematical equations, and theories, so long as we begin to accept that the real relationships are expressing the simple and elegant principles and processes and properties related to reflection, refraction, and recursion. So we could easily do away with most statements in physics as they're unnecessary to define the system, and observe, measure, and experiment with the reflective relationships being vividly expressed. The standard model is really as redundant as it is supernumerary. proportional to being deficient, and I believe that's becoming more and more clear as the theoretical physics statements are being made and determinations are being made. So we can do this if we realize that all of the relationships occurring in nature and the universe are expressions purely of holographic and reflective principles, processes, and properties. If we come to that understanding, or at least approach theorizing about what's really going on, approach it with that fundamental belief, then maybe we'll be able to more fully start to see all the relationships and how and how they're really being expressed and where they're coming from, and how this reality of holography is occurring. So we can say that the changes in temperature relative to convection, and these changes in temperature and this convective process is confined to the recursive mechanism, the recursive lattice, and it's not being expressed on the smooth surface where the information first was implanted. These changes in temperature is merely referring to the gradual diminishing of an intensity of light, an intensity of an electrically charged volume of information that we can observe and measure. It just merely represents the intensity of light information existing on a surface undergoing recursion, being expressed into a recursive matrix. And of course this would obviously implicate refraction. The refraction of light also would be inferred. So we can see that there is a volume of reflective particle information on the surface of the plane, and that this information is subsequently infinitely transferred down through the matrix or matrices right-left. The volume of information on the surface is stronger and fuller, would be, than the information, and when we say information we could actually expand that to represent heat, light, energy. Volume of information on the surface, the heat, light, energy on the surface, would be stronger and fuller than the information as it's expressed and copied supersymmetrically down the matrix. And we could also say that each stage of the copying of this information from the surface, or each individual separate recursive membrane or stage from the surface representing the virtual recursion, it represents the contraction of this surface information via the recursive mechanism down through the matrix, and as embodying the very virtual matrix. So these changes on the surface will be experienced as a change in frequencies down through the recursive vortex. Again, any changes, expansion, contraction on the surface is experienced proportionately down through and proportionately and gradually diminished down through the virtual lattice. The changes on the surface will be experienced as a change in frequencies down through the recursive vortex. The heat or information on the surface is technically being transferred down the line. And this line we're referring to as time continuums, arrows of time, and recursive functions existing entangled and existing simultaneous with each other, yet at two different points. So the heat from the surface is transferred down the line from stage to stage, membrane to membrane, and thus the heat or frequency of a particular membrane that's closer to the surface, and we'll refer to this surface as being the past or the beginning of the system, will be hotter than the cooler states of heat or frequency described maybe in a layer many stages away from the surface. Remember, we're talking about virtual copying infinitely, and we would refer anything, all membranes from the surface toward the right would be future membranes, and on the left side all information from the surface down the infinite row would be future membranes. And we would say as we come up from these future membranes toward the surface again, we're going through the present and back toward the past of the system on both sides. So all heat frequencies layers represent past conditions of heat frequency layers relative to present and future conditions of heat frequency and layers, and all this is expressed wherever